So now as we get into the Bible this morning, again, we've been working through a specific letter in the New Testament of the Bible. It's called 1 Corinthians, and Paul, who's a leader in the early church movement, this is about 20 years after the time of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, as far as a time stamp on that. But he's been involved starting a church in the center of ancient Greece, in a city called Corinth. And it's been a couple of years, and the people in that church have had some issues and some questions that they're asking for Paul's help with and advice with, and he's had some concerns expressed to him. And so it's a letter, but the overall arch of the letter is that when Paul looks at Jesus, he sees a very humble example, a very humble leader. And when the Corinthians, they consider all the issues that they're dealing with, and when Paul looks from the outside in on this church, he sees a lot of people that are kind of just consumed with themselves. And it's a very stark contrast to the humility of Jesus, who Paul believes is God in the flesh, God who's come to rescue humanity. And so to see God himself reflect a humility that these humans in Corinth can't wrap their minds around is just mind-boggling. And so Paul is just pleading with them throughout this letter to consider the way that they're living and to try to imitate Jesus' example in so many different ways of life. In the last couple of weeks, we've been toward the end in chapters 15 and 16, and we're looking at the topic of giving, of generosity. And Paul, he has this basic belief that making sacrifices for other people is worthwhile. And part of his reasoning behind that is because he believes in the resurrection, not just Jesus' resurrection, but that all of us, all of Jesus' followers someday will be raised to eternal life forever. And so it's not just about getting the most you can out of every moment on earth and then, expiring into oblivion. It's not that way. It's you're making investments now for something that will be future. And so Paul's perspective on that enables him to live selflessly and also to encourage this church to live selflessly as well to meet the needs, not only within the church, but there are some Christians in Jerusalem, which is about 1,800 miles away from Corinth, pretty far. But Paul encourages them in Corinth and in other parts of Greece, be concerned about other followers of Jesus' needs, not just the ones around the street, but the ones partially around the world. And so he's encouraging them to save up over time and contribute some resources to help these people who are suffering in the church in Jerusalem. And he challenged them to consider the partnership that they have with Jesus, because it's not just about doing good, it's about partnering with Jesus and with Jesus' community in this world, and seeing one another as a family of followers of Jesus, and seeing people who have contributed to their wealth spiritually with spiritual information and knowledge by sharing some of their physical, material possessions and funds and resources with the church in Jerusalem. And then also ultimately imitating God's kindness through doing that, which has been extended to all of us who didn't do anything to deserve it in the first place. And so Paul's using those examples to challenge Christians in their giving, and he's also suggesting a lot of practicality in their giving. Where on the first day of the week, the day that they would gather for worship services at that point in time in history, and the day that we're gathering today, the first day of the week, just to develop this habit of setting aside some of the extra that they have to meet other people's needs. And Paul says this is something that should be planned, it should be a personal choice, not something that you feel pressured into. Giving is not about that. It's not expectations or greed motivating us to give or hold back. It's about a choice, and it's about joy, and we'll get into more of that this morning. We're going to pick up where we left off last week, looking at different aspects of giving and generosity. Today we're going to take a look at the portion of our giving. How do we decide how much to give? How do we decide it's too much to give? How do we decide if something's not enough to give? And then also, how do we protect the gifts that we're giving and the resources that we've been entrusted with as people, as a church? Those are the kinds of questions we're going to take a look at a little bit today. Before we do, I'd like to hit some terms that might be unfamiliar to some of us. There's the word saints. It's going to crop up again today. And it's just talking about God's people in general, people who have devoted themselves by faith to carry out God's purposes in the world. And because of that, they deserve to be honored. But any follower of Jesus would qualify as a saint. So it's not something where you have to do something miraculous or jump through a lot of hoops or check a lot of boxes for Paul. It's really something that any follower of Jesus would be called. Also, we come into the term sow and sower, which kind of is like farming and farmer today. But sowing is a specific way of farming where you go around, you scatter seed across a field, then you plow over it to cover it over with dirt. And a sower is somebody who does that. So we come into that word today. And then the third one is righteousness, which has about 150 different definitions in Christian worlds. But at its basic, it means treating God and other people with the dignity that they deserve. But it's not the dignity that they deserve because they did something special. It's the dignity they deserve because they are who they are. So like any human is human, they're made in God's image, and so they deserve to be treated with dignity. And God is God, so God deserves just inherently, because of who he is, to be treated with dignity. So that's the idea behind righteousness we read about today. So let's jump into things. How much should we give? Paul says on the first day of the week, and we read this part last week, we didn't read the entire verse, each of you is to set something aside and save in keeping with how he or she is prospering. And it's that last phrase that we kind of want to focus on for a moment. And so it's not about suffering. We'll get into that in a second. Sometimes we look at giving and it's like the point of giving is just to impoverish us as much as possible, right? Almost this asceticism where we're denying ourselves pleasure in life, and that's really not the approach to giving. In fact, Paul would say, I think it usually should match a person's ability. And I say usually because there is an example that we read about this morning where people gave beyond their ability. And so there are times where you might be able to joyfully give sacrificially. You know it's going to hurt, but you believe in the need so much, or you care about the people so much, you're willing to make things really tight yourself in order to give. There are those moments, but overall giving is coming from a different angle. It's in a match with our own ability, how God is prospering us, how God's leading us along. We're going to go into 2 Corinthians 8 and 2 Corinthians 9 as well, which in timeline is about a year past what Paul's writing in 1 Corinthians. But it's at a point where Paul's getting ready to come by and collect what they've been saving up to give. And so he talks a lot about the process, and we get a lot of insights from the second letter to the Corinthians that we don't have in the first letter, so we're going to fill in some gaps with that this morning as well. So in 2 Corinthians 8, here's some of the information that gets filled in about the amount. He says, for if the eagerness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have. And so I really want to give, but I don't have enough, or I'm going to go in debt to give. Paul's not urging that to happen. He's saying it's acceptable according to, again, a person's ability to give. He says it's not that there should be relief for others and hardship for you, but it's a question of equality. And so Paul doesn't want the believers in Corinth to give themselves into the ground and just, disperse all their worldly possessions to help people prosper in Jerusalem. He's saying it's about equality. It's not about making your hardship and your suffering worse, right? The point is to alleviate suffering, not to make you suffer. That's the purpose behind giving. It continues this way. It says, during a severe trial brought about by affliction. And now this is the exception. There's some other Christians in northern Greece, not in Corinth, but in probably Philippi or Thessalonica or some of those other cities that Paul is interacting with. And they're going through a tough time. They're being afflicted in some way. Paul doesn't go into detail. He says their abundant joy and their extreme poverty overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. And so they just so much want to help because they identify with it. They know what it's like to suffer and to be impoverished. And they can identify with it so closely that they want to sacrificially give because they know what it's like. And so there are people that are choosing to do that, right? But it's their choice. And it's not necessarily the norm when we look at giving. The verse continues this way. It says, at the present time, your surplus, and this is a cool word picture. A lot of the words in the ancient Greek language that the New Testament was written in, they're very picture-oriented words, and I like things I can firmly imagine in my mind. I'm a very visual person, and so this is going to help us out hopefully in a moment. But he says, at the present time, your surplus is, literally it says, overflowing into their need, so that their abundance may in turn overflow into your need in order that there may be equality. And so Paul's going to hit that word equality again, and in America it's going to make some of us uncomfortable because that's not the way that our society functions, right? So he's dealing with surplus. And I want you to imagine it this way, okay? I want you to picture yourself as having a bucket this morning. Let's just say, I don't know, a gallon bucket, And the thing is we live in a desert, and it's getting pretty warm. Summer's approaching. And so we've been outside, and it's hot. We've been outside for 2 or 3 hours. And each of us, we have this bucket suddenly. And the bucket has varying amounts of water. And some of you look down in your bucket that magically appeared, as you're hot and thirsty, and there isn't a drop in that bucket. And you're just so discouraged. Like, what is this bucket for? Put dirt in or something? And then you notice, and other people notice, they look in the bucket, and some of them they're a quarter full of water. Some are half filled, and it's cool water. Some of this water has ice in it. And so they're thinking, oh, I'm thirsty, and they're starting to take a drink out of that bucket. And then other people, it's almost full. And then some people, a few people have these buckets, and they're overflowing. Because, this bucket magically appeared anyway, so we don't have to apply the law of physics here. So water's just perpetually springing up out of this bucket. And it's cool water, and it's cold water, right? And you're a community of people. You care about each other because you know each other like you do now. And so what are you going to do if your bucket is just overflowing and somebody else, they're holding it upside down, shaking it, and nothing's coming out, and they're hot and thirsty? How many of you might share a little bit of your extra with that person, right? Some of us, if we only have a quarter, we're looking at the person next to us with nothing going, you can have half of it, I'll take an eighth. At least I have something to quench my thirst, right? Now I want you to flip the script just a little bit. Okay, and imagine that each of us has a bucket, and all of us are in need. Food, shelter, supplies, transportation, education, different forms of care. Okay? And then we look at our magical bucket, and some of them are empty. And some of them are partially full to different degrees. And then some of them are continuously overflowing with money and resources and ability to have care and supplies and nice shelter and good education, right? How should we respond to each other as a community, right? But yet, it's so much easier to give somebody water. And I think it's because it doesn't cost us anything, honestly. In our society, water, it's cheap, right? It's everywhere. We live in a desert, but for living in a desert, we have pretty easy access. Turn on that faucet, and out comes the water. And it doesn't cost us. But when we think about the other things that we possess, to varying degrees, it's a little bit harder to envision that sense of community. But Paul, when he thinks about the portion, he's kind of leading us there. He says at the present time, again, your surplus is overflowing into their need, so that their abundance may in turn overflow into your need in order that there might be equality. And so if you remember one thing today, remember this number 2, this point here. Giving is about people using their surplus to supply what others are lacking so that a community can experience equality. I really feel like if you look at Paul's other writings, you look at some of Jesus' followers, you look at God of the Bible in the Old Testament, and you look at Jesus' teachings, you have to land on a spot pretty close to this. That is what biblical giving really is about. And there's also this idea that just because you have a lot now doesn't mean that you always will. If you read books like Ecclesiastes, and I won't talk about this very much because Carly and I had a conversation about this the other day, so I have a feeling she may be bringing some of this up at some point. But Ecclesiastes talks about unpredictable life is, right? You just never know. One day you've got it all, and the next day you lose something crucial. Your funds, your health, your portfolio, your housing, something. Like a lot of things can happen because life's unpredictable. And so when you exist in community, it's almost like a form of insurance to a degree, right? Because you're caring for each other. And life is unpredictable, and Paul is saying that. And he's going to quote from something here, and this is an Old Testament story. It's about Israel walking around in the wilderness for 40 years, and you can read the story in Exodus, and that really gives a big narrative of it. But God's people, they find themselves out of slavery in Egypt, which is great, but it creates another problem because when you're enslaved, the taskmasters would at least feed you consistently so you could keep doing the work and keep building the stuff and making the bricks and building the structures for the Pharaoh. But now that they're on their own in a desert, they don't have a lot of supplies. And so God, very generously, despite their complaining attitude consistently, he decides to provide this miraculous form of food for them. And what happens is he tells them in the morning, you're going to have dew all over the ground. When the dew evaporates, there's going to be these white flakes, and you need to gather up enough for each person every day. Don't get more than 2 quarts worth per person, but take as much as you think you need, everybody, and don't keep it overnight because it's going to start to rot if you keep it more than a day. And so day by day by day, with the exception of the 7th day, which they didn't gather on that day, they got 2 days supply on Friday to cover into Saturday as well. But with that one exception, they were just working, or they were just living day by day at the mercy of God. And so Paul's talking about that story when he says this. The person who had much didn't have too much, and the person who had little didn't have too little. If you gathered a little extra that day, you probably could look around in your family or the tents around yours and figure out, oh, somebody didn't gather quite enough for that day. And it's all going to rot by the end of the day anyway, because that's the way God designed it. So if you have too much, what are you going to do? Keep it? No, because the next day it'll be gone. You're just going to share it with the other person around you who you see needs more. And so Paul is encouraging followers of Jesus in ancient Corinth, and I think maybe it would be wise for us to consider some of this wisdom as well. But he's encouraging them to have more of that type of an attitude toward the way that they live. He instructs them to store what's needed for daily living, ensure that those who have less have enough, and rely on God for future provisions, right? And it's a communal approach, again, to money, which is really challenging for us as Americans. Because in America, ideals like independence, investing, retirement, these are huge things for us, and many of us could never even think outside of those bounds, right? But these are privileges that have been out of reach throughout most of history, and they remain out of reach for much of the world today. And so Jesus and his humility, it doesn't just challenge the Corinthians' culture, it actually challenges ours in some ways too. And I'm not going to tell you how that should play out for you individually, but as you consider the portion of your giving, these are principles and perspectives to keep in mind that are not at the forefront of our thoughts as Americans today, right? Also, Paul suggests the amount that's given, that amount should be motivated by attitudes, right? So a part of it isn't just what's my ability, it's what can I give and have a good attitude in doing so, right? It should be an attitude of generosity that motivates the gift. It should be an attitude of celebration that motivates the gift, and an attitude of thankfulness that motivates the gift. He continues on, and this is, again, a further conversation in the second letter to the Corinthians that we have. Paul in that letter says, the point is this, the person who sows, there's that term, archaic term kind of for us today, that scatters seed. The person who scatters sparingly will also reap or harvest sparingly, and the person who sows generously will also reap generously. You think about a miserly farmer, who's walking out there and just scattering a few little seeds here and there, and then somebody else is just throwing seed out, right? And it's just a good reminder, because if we have a greedy approach to giving, it deprives people who are needy right now, but it's also something that hurts us. It impacts us in the long run. Because people know when we're stingy, right? And that doesn't just affect, maybe we grow in wealth, but our relationships are harmed as a result of it. And so there's more to consider, right? Giving should be done with generosity. And again, it's a community approach in this culture in the Bible, and I think that's something we can really learn from today. Meeting needs is a community responsibility. And here in America, it is not. It is an individual responsibility. And it's hard for us to think in terms of community, but I really think we can learn from that trait in the ancient world, something that challenges us as well. In 2 Corinthians 9:7, it says, each person should do as he decided to do in his heart, not reluctantly or out of compulsion, since God loves a cheerful giver. And so the idea behind that, too, is there's a joy in giving, cheerfulness, and the way that it's phrased has this underlying idea that you look and you see an opportunity to show kindness. Not kindness because somebody's your best friend or because they did something for you last week, but just somebody who's in need of kindness. They didn't do anything to earn it. You just want to disperse it. And you see that opportunity and you just get excited about it. And so that prompts giving. I'm going to kind of summarize this in a moment. So there's also another section, and if you want to read into it a little bit later, you can if you want to read the details. But there's a long section in 2 Corinthians 9, verses 8 through 12, where Paul talks about thanksgiving as well. And the idea in this section, just to summarize it, is every good thing that we have ultimately comes from God. Because maybe you worked really hard to get something. That's fine. But where did you get the life that you have to work? Where did you get the ability, the skills, the strength, the brain that's processing all of this, right? The time, right? Some people don't have time. Some people don't even get time at all, right, in this life. Very, very little. Their lives are cut short. But maybe you've had a lot of time. And so even those basics are because God has provided it, right? And then when you give, Paul also brings up the fact that oftentimes people, they offer thanks when you give to them. But in this community of Christ, it's not just about thanking the giver, it's about thanking God. And maybe you're practicing principles that Jesus talks about, like giving privately with charitable giving. And so maybe the people who are receiving, they don't even know who to thank, but they know that God's responsible and God's looking out for them. And so can you give with generosity and with joy and with thankfulness? If not, what's even the point? The thing I want to finish on this morning is a little bit about protecting the gift. And maybe we can go overboard on this. I think a lot of things in the Bible can be held in balance, and so balance is key. But this is back to 1 Corinthians 16, our passage that we're in verse 3. Paul says, when I arrive, and the idea is to come this is the process of organizing the collection and transporting it to Jerusalem. So when I arrive, I will send with letters those you recommend to carry your gift to Jerusalem. And it's a quick statement, but I think there's actually a lot that's going on in here. I'll arrive, I will send letters vouching for basically those you recommend to carry your gift to Jerusalem. So there's a lot of different moving parts, and Paul is not calling all the shots. He's allowing the churches to choose who will represent them and who will take care of this gift in transition from Greece, 1,800 miles, to Jerusalem. This is not a small sum of money, right? It's a lot of responsibility. And so we're seeing that there's some resources, and there's a trusted group that's going to be chosen to administer those resources. It's going to be chosen by the represented churches, and there's also going to be people from among the represented churches. So they're going to know people. There's going to be a pretty big trust factor in this, and so there should be. And I think these are valuable principles for us to import today as well. When we're thinking about managing resources, there needs to be an element of trustworthiness. If you read further in 2 Corinthians 8, again, this is the later on story, a year from where we're at in 1 Corinthians 16, but the people that are chosen, we get a little bit more information about them. Titus is one, but there's some other ones as well that are not named. And we find out, one, that these people, they care about other people. They have a heart of ministry and service toward other people. So they're not just like financially capable people. They care about humans deeply. They're very diligent people, and they're humble people. And those are the overarching characteristics that seem to go into choosing people who are going to handle this money well and protect it. And we're also taking a look at leaders. In 2 Corinthians 8, 20 and 21, it says, Paul's talking about himself and some other church leaders, we're taking this precaution so that no one will criticize us about this large sum that we're administering. Indeed, we're giving careful thought to do what is right, not only before the Lord, but also before people. And so there's some caution here, right? And as a leader, Paul's careful to avoid things, actions, and the way that he handles money in ways that might either, first of all, dishonor God, or second of all, be criticized by other people. Because most of us, we've seen somebody mismanage money, right? And we've had these thoughts in our minds, Or we've seen people embezzle money or extort people or, do much worse things with money. And so we know how we view that. And Paul says with money, there can be a lot of opportunity for criticism. So we want to be really careful with how we handle this, how we manage this. We want to protect it. He says, if it's suitable for me to go as well, they will travel with me. So Paul's saying, if it works out, I'll provide an extra layer of accountability. I'll go with them too. And we know from how the story plays out that Paul does go to Jerusalem, because that's the domino that gets knocked over, him in Jerusalem, that results in him going through a couple years of imprisonment and eventually a trial before Caesar in Rome and all these things that play out in church history. But he does go with them to, again, ensure accountability for that, because it's something that so many people have given toward and even sacrificed toward. It's important that it be managed well. So here's how I want to wrap up these things this morning. This is a little 2-minute summary. First of all, giving, it's your personal choice. Don't give because somebody forces you into it or you feel like there's an expectation. It's a personal choice. The purpose is not to intensify your hardship and your suffering. Maybe you felt that way before, or people have misled you to believe that. That's not the point, but rather to relieve suffering and to create equal opportunities and access to resources within a community. In this case, specifically within a church community, right? And that approach, it defies our conventional American thinking. Giving involves limiting our storage to what's necessary for daily living and investing our surplus in others instead of saving obsessively or constantly accumulating more and more and more and more. And whatever we do choose to give amount-wise, we should be able to do it with generosity, with joy, and with thankfulness. Otherwise, maybe we should reassess the amount that we're giving or the type of resource that we're giving up. And ultimately, we give because everything we have comes from God, and we have the ability as followers of Jesus to recognize that and to see that. Also, the resources that we collect, especially as a church, really should be managed wisely. We should make sure that the people who are managing these resources are trusted, that they're caring, right? They're not just financially capable, but they care about people, and they're diligent people, and they should be chosen ideally by people that they're represented, by those represented. And we too should put layers of accountability in to avoid dishonoring God and the criticism of others, which is one of the reasons why we publish our budgets and make all of our financial statements and stuff available to you all as church family. And so if you have any desire to see anything or access anything, we want to be transparent. But we're trying to apply these principles as a church, and then as we give individually, there's a lot of wisdom in these passages. But ultimately, it's something that you do, that God motivates you to do. And so follow God's leading in your life on that. Maybe you're suffering and you're going through your hardships, and so the right thing to do is just to hold off. And maybe you're super abounding. You don't know what to do with all your resources. You're looking around, what can I invest in? How can I use this? Maybe there's needs right in front of you, that you can direct that overflow into. But it's just want to encourage you, before the Lord, seek what he wants you to give, how to meet the needs of people.